Thanks to the organizers for giving me an opportunity to speak. So I will try to speak about, give a different definition of weak omega categories that is equivalent to the one that was used in the previous talk, and try to use this to construct the opposite of an omega category and home omega categories between two objects that we already saw in the previous talk appearing. This is based on two preprints. The first one is joined with Dean, Pfister, Reuther, and Vicari, and it's actually not a preprint anymore. It's been published recently, and the second one is a preprint that is recently uploaded on archive. So, what is a weak omega category? Here I will be speaking again about globular algebraic model of weak omega categories, weak infinity categories. So globular means, as we saw, that they're pre-sheaves on the side of globes. So diagrams of sets like this, we have higher cells of every dimension with source and target functions satisfying two identities. Algebraic meaning that they will be globular sets equipped with some type of a composition and coherence operations. And the weak meaning that certain diagrams will admit a composite that's unique up to some higher invertible cell. And those diagrams we will call globular pasting diagrams and see in a bit more detail in a moment. So what are they? They are certain diagrams they are certain globular sets that satisfy some type of direct contractibility, I guess. But those are the diagrams that admit a unique composite in strict omega categories. And they can be parameterized in different ways. They are known as globular cardinals, as zigzag sequences, or rooted planar trees. And here you can kind of see in those pictures how to move between them. I'll get to that in a moment again. But speaking more precisely, there's different models of what omega categories are. So probably the first one is by Batanin and Leinster, using contractible globular operands. Then there's a different model by Grothendieck and Maltsignotis, using certain globular theories called coherators. And more recently, two more models have been introduced. Two different ways to define omega categories have been introduced. There's a dependent type theory called CAT, whose models are omega categories, and we've given a new presentation of them recently using an adjunction with a category of computeds and using inductive types. And there have been equivalences between all those models, so we know that all four of those theories basically describe the same type of omega categories, the same type of object. So I mentioned that we have a new presentation using computeds. Those are omega categories that are in some sense freely generated. So the way you build them is that you start from some set of objects. You build all the zero terms of an omega category. Well, we have no operations of dimension zero in omega categories, so that's just an equality. I'm not doing anything interesting. Then you adjoin some one cells, and what you can do is build formal composites and formal composites of those one cells. Then you adjoin two cells whose source and target are themselves formal composites or generators, I guess, of dimension 1, and continue this process to get higher dimensional structures. And here the crucial thing I want to point out is how this set cell n is defined. It's defined inductively using two different constructors. First of all, that every generator of a computed will be a cell of the free infinity category it generates. And secondly, we have this rule that says that every time I have a pasting diagram, some collection of cells that should be composed inside a computed, and I specify a way to compose the source and a way to compose the target. This is what the U and V play in this picture. Then I get a way to compose. Then I can produce a new formal composite of those cells. Formal composite. And depending on the dimension of the pasting diagram, this gives us both the composition operations that we want omega categories to have and the coherence operations that we want them to have. Crucially here, I'm here to define the set of n cells. I'm using morphisms of computers. Those are diagrams of composable cells. And what I mean by morphisms of computers will be a map that sends the generators of the first computer into potentially composites in the second one. So this is some type of Kleistli category. Those will be the morphisms of omega categories that we get in a moment. And there's an adjunction between globular sets and computers, where every globular set can be seen as a computed where the source and target of every generator is a generator, and vice versa. Well, if a computed is a diagram like the one on the left, I basically keep the column on the right, and that's it's what I call this underlying globular set here. And so the main definition is that the category of omega categories is the category of algebras for this mod we just introduced. What this means in more detail is that omega categories are a globular set equipped with some type of operations, parameterized by the cells that we defined in the previous slide, subject to some type of source and target conditions. And morphisms of omega categories are strict functors, so morphisms of globular sets that preserve those operations strictly. And just a small remark, computers embed fully faithfully into omega categories, so we can identify a computed with a free omega category that it generates. Now, having said that, let's get into the construction of the opposite of an omega category. Well, just let's recall that globular sets are diagrams of the form that you see on the slide. So collections of cells in every dimension with source and target maps. We can easily define the opposite of a globular set by just reversing the source and target, exchanging the source and target map at some dimension. And of course we can do this thing for any set of dimensions that one chooses. Now, to extend this to omega categories, what we need to do is basically say how to equip the underlying globular set, the opposite globular set, with the operations of omega categories again. And so what we want to do is construct a functor that would make this square commute. This is equivalent to defining a morphism of monads from the free omega category monad to itself, but over the equivalence op that we have. And by the mate correspondence, we can transpose this again to get a morphism from op. And what we need is just a morphism from op of the monad to the monad composed with op that satisfies certain compatibility with the multiplication and the unit axioms. And we can build those things inductively by observing first that globular pasting diagrams are actually closed under the operation of forming opposite globular sets. So if we start with this pasting diagram here, which can be seen as the composite of as a 3-cell whiskered with some 2-cell, and then whiskered on the right with a 1-cell. Applying the one opposite applying the two opposite would basically swap all the arrows upside down, and we get again something that looks like a pasting diagram that should admit a composite. Same if we take the one opposite, we just exchange the left whiskering with the right whiskering. And finally, we could take the opposite in both dimensions at the same time to get a whiskering on top and whiskering on the left from what we started before. And this is an example, but we can also see if we can see this using trees, and actually we can define the operation of forming the opposite of a tree and show that it's compatible with its interpretation as globular pasting diagrams. Having done this, we can proceed to define the opposite of computed inductively. So what we're going to do is define at the same time an endofunctor of computeds, which takes a computed and reverses the source and target in some set of dimensions, and observe that this is somehow compatible with forming the free omega category in this computed, by which I mean that we have a natural equivalence, an isomorphism on the right hand side of the square, and those are defined mutually inductively, meaning that we first define the opposite of an n-dimensional computed, and then we define the natural transformation on n-dimensional cells, and proceed by induction on dimension to define it eventually for computeds of arbitrary dimension. So the computed C-op has the same generators as the computed C, with source and target exchanged, and composed with the natural transformation of prime to make sure that we get the correct type, I guess, the correct targets for this function. On the other hand, for a morphism of computeds, we basically do the same thing. To form the opposite, we compose with the natural transformation of prime. And we define the natural transformation of prime to be the identity on generators, and to swap the composites, swap a composite over a pasting diagram to give us a composite over the opposite pasting diagram, with either the same source and target or the opposite source and target, depending on whether this is one of the directions that we want to invert or not. And what we observed in our paper is that the same technique can be used to define homomega categories and suspensions of omega categories. So, again, another way to see globular sets is that they are defined co-inductively as graphs enriched over globular sets, which means that for every pair of objects in a globular set, we can define a homoglobular set of arrows from the first object to the second one. And this is functorial. It takes a bipointed globular set into a globular set. And it's easy to check that this functor has a left adjoint, the suspension function, which shifts all the cells of a globular set up one in dimension, and adds two new points that play the role of the source of all the cells and target of all the cells. So what we're going to try to do is basically repeat this story and try to lift the home functor again to omega categories by observing that the category of bipoint omega categories are again algebras for some monad, which are induced by a similar adjunction to the one we had before, the free cell adjunction, but keeping in mind the base points. So we want to lift the functor like this. That amounts to building a monad morphism. Again, by transposing, this basically tells us that what we need to do is build the suspension of a computed to understand how to build the homomega category. And that would tell us how to lift the home functor, but there's a theorem of, I believe, Johnstone, an adjoint lifting theorem, which tells us that if we can lift if we have a situation like this where we have two categories of algebras that are suitably co-complete and an adjunction in the base, then if we manage to lift the right adjoint, there's some lift of the left adjoint as well that commutes with the free functors. So if we want to define the suspension of an omega category, it suffices to define the home of a bipoint omega category. And we can do this inductively in the same way that we did for the opposites. So the observation is that pasting diagrams are again closed under the suspension functor. So this amounts to, we can illustrate this with this example, but on the level of trees, this amounts to taking a tree and growing a root. So suspending everything, moving everything up by one level. And then the definition of the suspension of a computed and the suspension of a cell basically is quite similar. So if I have a computed like this, what I'm going to do is move the generators up one dimension and add two new generators at two new zero cells. The source and target, I'm not writing it down here, but they're given in a similar manner by composing with this natural transformation sigma prime. And sigma prime is defined again inductively on the dimension by using the suspend pasting diagrams that I showed in the previous slide. So, summarizing those points, we have given an inductive description of computeds and weak omega categories. We have constructed the opposites of those structures, and we have lifted the suspension Hom adjunction to computeds and omega categories. And since I have the time, I should add that we've also studied whether computeds are preserved by those functors and how those functors interact with each other. So, for example, we know that the Hom functor preserves computeds which are somehow cofibrant omega categories. And there's still various directions that one could take from here. So what we want to do is understand invertible cells and weak equivalence. So basically continuing the work that we saw in the previous talk. And we have a poster tomorrow that shows how we can compute inverses, at least in 3 omega categories, in a much shorter way using the techniques that I tried to show in this talk. And we are hoping that those might help us in building the path objects, so cylinders and cones for omega categories. So that's maybe a step towards eventually having some model structure and understanding colimits, but we are still many steps away from that. And with that, I guess I would like to thank you again for your attention. And yeah.
Any questions? Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask you, have the suspension functor now. Have you thought about potentially like monoidal omega categories, like some notion of this, and how suspension might give you construction for that?
We have thought about it actually. So I should mention, as I said in the models, one of the models of infinity categories that we have is a dependent type theory, CAT, or one of the ways to present this, to present omega categories. And actually, Thibaut has done a lot of work in his thesis to define a similar type theory whose models are monoidal omega categories. So we know how to do this thing, and we are also thinking about maybe being able to do k-tuply suspended monoidal categories, but this doesn't seem to be as we're not 100% sure what's the correct way to go. The reason is that if you take a free weak omega category with one object and let's say no one-dimensional generators, because of unary composites and the various operations of omega categories, you end up with many different one cells, while you would hope that something that's k-tuply monoidal would only have one cell, one L cell for every L less than k or something.
You need like an enforced strictness at those levels.
Exactly, that's the direction we're thinking about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you for the talk. So I guess I'm sort of wondering if there's... So, as you presented it here, it all looks fairly kind of... I mean, somehow the picture's very clear.
Mm-hmm.
But as I recall, when you actually go into the details, there's a lot of syntax involved, right?
Yes, so essentially the thing that I hid maybe in my talk is that morphisms of computeds and the free omega category in a computed are basically defined by mutual induction.
Yeah.
So yes, there's some inductive machinery that one needs to deal with.
So I was wondering if there's sort of possibly a more formal treatment, because somehow the ingredients that go into this are the strict omega category monad, and then the notion of the boundary of an N cell.
Mm-hmm.
So from those two things, everything else sort of comes out of that somehow. And then somehow the fact that the opposite lifts to weak omega categories. I mean, the opposite lifts to strict omega categories.
Of course.
Similarly, the Hom lifts to strict omega categories. So somehow I'm wondering if from that ingredient plus something about boundaries or something, you can kind of see these in a sort of unified way.
I guess the unified way would be to observe that any type of endofunctor, for example, of globular sets that somehow preserves preserves the arities of the operations should be lifted by exactly the same formula that I gave for the opposite here. So that's, I guess, the closest I could say. The main reason we did not try to develop a formal way to describe what gets lifted and what doesn't is because we only had those two examples at the time, and we only realized the second one was obtained after we had written most of the paper. But I'm not sure I have a better answer, I'm afraid.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Cool. I guess there's another assumption between like the loop space construction and reduced suspensions. Do you expect that also lifts to weaken the
It should be doable the exact same way, like just a 1-point suspension instead of a 2-point suspension.
You said you didn't develop geometry what and what doesn't get lifted because you only had 2 examples at the time. You have more now?
No, but at least the other things we're trying to lift and understand at the moment we don't know how to incorporate them in this case. They seem quite more complicated, so I don't know. So we're trying to think about, for example, naturality of the operations of my categories. So understanding something like the square you had in the previous talk about naturality of the unitor, for example, or whiskering, where it seems to be a bit more, has a lot more combinatorics in it.
Yeah.
I was wondering, does the opposite lift to contractions of globular sets, for example? So if you take the opposite of a contraction between globular sets, I guess that's a contraction. It preserves all the structure, so I imagine you could sort of use that to get opposites of globular infinity categories, since they're sort of defined using contractions. It's just
Makes sense. I hadn't thought about that, but it's like we haven't really used the machinery of globular operators since we have this syntactic presentation. So I haven't thought much about how to go, but that sounds reasonable.
Maybe a follow-up question just on that. I mean, as you see it, you see that the syntactic approach actually has the potential for advantages over the globular approach, and that's what I understand, because it has sort of naturally has an inductive character and syntax and stuff. Is that?
I don't know if it's. I wouldn't say that it's better or not, but it definitely allows us to do a lot of constructions by induction, and especially for constructions that we don't necessarily understand how to fully complete at the time. Being able to do them by induction on some type of dimension and depth, or like the syntax, allows us to also use a computer, like a proof assistant, basically to check some of the computation for us, and to also sometimes produce more complicated terms. So I should mention that both the suspension and the opposites have been implemented as part of a proof assistant for the type theory cut. So one could use them directly to build more complicated terms, but maybe speak to Thibaut better tomorrow at the poster session for more details on this.
Yes.
Just maybe like one technical question. For weak morphisms, I understand these are often done with like some co-fiber replacement, as was mentioned last month as well. Have you checked that like these operations still work when you do weak morphisms? So you get like the offer suspension of a weak morphism as well.
We haven't checked, but the fact that opposites are defined using a morphism of monads here with computeds, the fact that we have a morphism of monads like this, and essentially the cofibrant replacement is also defined using an adjunction between computeds and omega categories, makes me quite confident that it will be possible and shouldn't be very hard to write down the opposite of a weak functor. It's just we need some type of distributivity between the opposites and the cofibrant replacement, basically.
Any other questions? I have maybe one last question. So this is based on the CAT syntax, I guess, is it?
Yes.
And I mean, do you have or do you imagine some syntax for like a user defining an omega category via copy tags in a proof assistant, like in some interactive way?
So because computers are infinite objects, I don't think that I don't know how that would be implemented, but CAT is, I guess, the closest we have. So I should mention also that contexts in CAT are precisely the finite computers, or the syntactic category of CAT coincides with the full subcategory of computers that contains the finite objects. So we could, in that proof assistant, I guess, work with finite computers at least, and their finite categories only.
Okay, thanks. All right, well, let's thank Ioannis again.